Welcome to a new Energy News interview. Today, we have a very special presence of Mr. Tucker Perkins, CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council. Hello, Mr. Perkins. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing well and I'm looking forward to being with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have this interview with you. So, with no more further introduction, I will start with the first question if you are ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, Mr. Perkins. Why is the electrify everything movement hurting the fight against climate change?
Well, there are probably 3 or 4 reasons, but I would say with certainty the biggest thing that it's delaying the current ability to decarbonize. So as we would tend to say, we are looking for perfection and stepping over good. So the whole urgency to make subtle changes today, to decarbonize today where we can, whether it's through conservation, to move from coal to natural gas, all of that is hurting the urgency of doing something now. I think if I could also move a little bit past the urgency, we're beginning to see it in Europe. We're certainly beginning to see it now in America. It's also beginning to impact the reliability of the current grid. And, whether we want to admit it or not, power is life. And frankly, the absence of power can be death. So to move to a less reliable grid is not good for consumers. It's not good for business. It's not good for our growth as a country or a world. And I think lastly, the costs. We're beginning to see the cost of electricity go up. So the current conversation is hurting the fight against climate change because we're not doing the things to address climate change today. We're delaying things that we could do today for events 20, 30, 40 years out. But we're beginning to pay the price in reliability and also in rising costs. And I would say, frankly, we're also clearly seeing that at least the early adoption, we're not getting the results that we hoped. I mean, again, we didn't predict some of this, but we use more coal than we predicted because the grid is growing fast. That certainly has a negative impact. And so we're not only are we delaying what we could be doing today, not only are we raising the cost of electricity while decreasing the reliability of electricity, we're really not having the impact on the climate to support all of those, failures.
Yes, that's true. What are the biggest energy-related myths taking carbon policy down the wrong path?
Well, I would say probably that electrifying everything is the single path to a clean climate. And again, I don't look really past Europe. In many cases, I find Europe is 4 or 5 years past us. And certainly there are some places in the world by either how much sun they have or how much wind they have, or frankly, how they use electricity, that they can use more renewable solar wind than most. But I would say, studying this and talking with a lot of people, the minute your renewable portfolio exceeds about 50% of your grid power, then bad things start happening. And those bad things we're not capable of dealing with yet, right? The mix of intermittent sources, when the wind blows, when the sun shines, versus a need to have base load operations. And I think people don't really realize that the way you mitigate that is through energy storage, but we're not ready for that yet, right? We're not ready for realistic, large volume energy storage. We're certainly using batteries. So the biggest myth for sure is that the narrow path called electrification is the only path to a clean climate. Now, so I really probably can't just say what's the myth without saying part of it, what's the truth. And I think the truth is that fossil fuels aren't necessarily bad and electricity is not necessarily good. Some fossil fuels probably are bad, right? Coal, oil, wood. But I might argue in that same vein, electricity made from coal, oil, and wood are also bad. So it's not that fossil fuels are bad and electricity is good. It's a much broader conversation with that. And of course, I come to the table with the belief that there are low carbon fossil fuels, if you will. And I don't use that word very often at all. I use the word low carbon fuels, propane, natural gas, that are infinitely better than all of the other spectrum of fuels. And they need to be included in this conversation around a clean climate.
Yes. What is the newest renewable source?
Well, I think, I know most listeners would hope I would talk about solar or wind or battery storage, but clearly I think for us, the newest renewable source is really renewable liquid fuels. And in my case, I really specialize in renewable propane, but certainly we're seeing a real migration to renewable diesel, to sustainable aviation fuel. And we're really encouraged that where we are today and where we think we can be in 2030 and then again in 2040 with zero carbon renewable propane. And just in the last 4 or 5 years, and I've really been in this market since it started, to see the changes that have happened over the last 6 months or 1 year. It used to be, if you think about carbon intensity, and I don't think people realize this, the carbon intensity of the grid today, the electric grid in the US today, if you boil all those sources down, nuclear, wind, hydroelectric, solar, natural gas, coal, the carbon intensity of the grid today is about 154. The carbon intensity of propane today is about 80. So if you want to decarbonize today, would you eliminate propane and use electricity? No, right? You can clearly see it's almost a factor of 2 to 1. The renewable fuels that we're bringing on, they started with a carbon intensity of 20. We kind of cut that down in half to 11. And the next stream we're going to bring on has not been scored yet by California Air Resources Board, but we think when it's scored, it will be carbon zero. And so all of a sudden now we're bringing energy dense liquid renewable fuels with a carbon intensity of 0. And as I'm quick to say, if you really think about energy on the full economic cycle, the full fuel cycle from beginning to end, it will be arguably some of the cleanest energy that we can access. So the newest renewable source for me is renewable propane. And I think we are in the early stages of the development of even new and smart streams.
Wow, it's very interesting. Thank you. What are the innovation ranges in the propane industry?
Well, I think, this is an area that we've worked on for years, right? We really work because we view diesel fuel as a principal competitor. So for really the last decade, we've worked on fuel efficiency and durability, because if anything, diesel fuel was a energy dense, powerful fuel, and the engines lasted a long time. And we felt like if we're going to compete with diesel fuel, we need to compete with them on thermal efficiency and durability. And so if we think about innovation in engines, which are really the backbone of not just things that go down the road, but so many off-road power generation, forklifts, port handling, so many issues. We now are to the point in our latest innovation with Cummins Engine Company, we're bringing engines into the market that have the same durability profile and the same thermal efficiency as diesel engines.
You also talk about the need for a 3D energy grid. What does it mean? How does it work?
Well, I think so many people don't really think about the complexity of the energy grid. And the one thing that always strikes me is our two big sources, electricity and natural gas, they're both just-in-time delivery, right? There's a wire to your house, there's a pipeline perhaps to your home. And when that pipeline works, you have power and natural gas. But when that pipeline's not there, you no longer have what you need. And we see it with hurricanes and wildfires, that you want power, you need power, but it's not there for you. The 3D energy grid I talk about, one, acknowledges that we have this vast network of power lines overhead. We have this vast network of pipelines underground. And it's interesting to me as a former natural gas pipeline person. I designed pipelines, I built pipelines, I owned and maintained pipelines. There's this network of thought that underground pipelines are bad. And I would say, clearly, it's the safest way to transport energy. It's perhaps the most efficient way to transport energy. and it's out of sight and out of mind. And we need to continue to use this vast, bought and paid for network of pipelines underground. So energy overhead, energy underground, the middle, though, the vast middle is where it really makes those two things work. Now we begin to talk about energy storage, right? Energy storage, you think of it as a battery. It could also be the size of the propane tank in your home, and it could be the size of the propane tank in your industry, right? Just back from Puerto Rico, looking at some pharmaceutical manufacturing, they're relying expressly on electricity generated from propane. Why? They're in complete control of their electric grid, right? They own the grid, they own the equipment that produces electricity, and they own the storage network. So the 3D energy grid that I love to talk about are wires overhead, pipelines underground, both of them delivering electricity, natural gas, gasoline, diesel fuel perhaps, and then the vital center, which are those fuels that go beyond traditional infrastructure, propane where you want it, when you need it, and the quantity you need it, and the ability to store energy. So now you're no longer bound to a just-in-time delivery system.
Yes, I like that vision also. In the current energy transition period, what business conditions and decisions are companies facing?
Well, I think if we just even let me take the word energy out of that for a second, in the current business climate, what are companies facing? And, we work with companies every day, and we see, one, companies are facing rising costs across the board, right? Rising cost of labor, rising cost of materials, rising cost of electricity. So they're facing rising costs, and really consumers always want to push back against rising costs. So it's a tough business climate right now, coming out of COVID, not having adequate supply chain, not having adequate workers. And so it's a tough business climate in general. Now we layer on the complexity of a failing energy system. And I hate to use that word, but I think particularly in the US, we have to acknowledge, electrical interruption is going up. We just did a study looking at interruptions nationally and then really on a state-by-state basis. And the interruption for power is up really across the country. And certainly where we have hurricanes and wildfires and tornadoes, it's worse there than ever. But, business doesn't need a fragile electric grid that's more expensive. They need a steady and reliable, resilient power grid that in fact is affordable. And so the two things that I really see are that industry already in a tough position now faces a fragile grid and rising electric costs at the very point that they need a reliable energy system and, if anything, steady costs. I mean, we would always prefer falling costs. And I think we're actually even on the very front end of the ability, we're going to see the grid become more fragile. We're talking about taking away nuclear power plants. We're certainly taking away, eliminating hydroelectric electricity, the two cleanest ways that we can make electricity, and frankly, in volume, some of our largest contributors to the grid. And we're not going to get there by a solar farm here and there, a wind farm here or there. And so business is facing this issue where they're trying to make their products and deliver their goods and services at a rising cost.
You is very interesting. Finally, Mr. Perkins, would you like to add something more related with this topic?
No, I mean, I just always appreciate the dialogue, because I find this isn't a dialogue that can be had in, 2-second sound bites or a picture on TikTok or Instagram, right? It's the energy complex, as I'm quick to say, is in fact very complex. And, I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. We actually came to this not trying to make a position for propane. We really came to this trying to understand where we think energy needs to go. And we've come out of it realizing that most people say, why would propane, why does the fuel that I think about powering my grill, why is that a part of the energy solution? And now we see, I'm just back from a power conference, and we're talking about, how we're going to participate in vehicle charging, mobile vehicle charging, how we're going to participate in mobile power generation. We're already producing power. People don't realize it through the Virgin Islands, Roatan Bay, Honduras, most of the Caribbean that we thought might use liquefied natural gas. They're beginning to look to propane as a cheaper, cleaner, easier to deal with alternative. And we see that all over the world. So we're glad to be a part of this conversation. I appreciate, what people like you are doing to help facilitate that conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker Perkins, CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council, for giving us this interview. It was very interesting. And as you said, information. We need very much information to know what is really going on, no? And thank you all for the audience, and see you soon in another new energy interview. Thank you, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.